Imagine I'm standing in the lobby of my son-in-law's firm on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing the same canvas jacket I've owned for 11 years. When he steps out of the conference room, sees me, and laughs. He actually laughs. Then he turns to the man beside him, his managing partner, and says, "Sorry about this, Richard. That's my father-in-law. He gets turned around sometimes. Frank, the family dinner is at my house, not here." His colleagues look at me the way people look at a dog that wandered into a restaurant. But Richard Harmon doesn't laugh. He goes very still. Then he says quietly, "Brian, this is Frank Caldwell. He owns the Williamson tract." My son-in-law's smile doesn't disappear all at once. It dissolves, piece by piece, like ice in warm water. And that was only the beginning. The October air had that particular sharpness that arrives in Middle Tennessee just before the leaves finish turning. I drove the 40 minutes from my farmhouse outside Murfreesboro into Nashville with the truck windows cracked. The kind of drive I'd taken 1,000 times over 38 years, building Caldwell Construction and Development from a two-man operation out of my garage into a company that employed 300 people and reshaped half the commercial corridor between Nashville and Franklin. I sold it 2 years ago for $19 million. I was 61 years old, and I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. My wife, Ruth, had passed 4 years before that. Cancer, quick and brutal. After she was gone, the company felt like a habit more than a purpose. So I sold it, kept the farmhouse, bought a reliable truck, started sleeping 8 hours a night for the first time since I was 25. My daughter Claire and her husband Brian lived in a new construction neighborhood in Brentwood, the kind of development where every house looked like the architect had taken one design and stretched or compressed it slightly for variety. Brian's house was the largest on the street. He'd made sure of that. He was 39 years old, a senior associate at Harmon & Associates, a commercial real estate law firm with a reputation for handling major development projects across the state. He wore tailored suits on weekends. He drove a Porsche Cayenne that he'd mentioned the price of on 3 separate occasions within the first year I knew him. He had opinions about wine that he shared whether anyone asked or not. I pulled into their driveway on a Sunday in October for what Claire had called a casual family dinner. The Porsche sat out front like a statement. I parked my F-150 beside it and noticed the difference seemed to entertain Brian when he opened the door. "Frank," he said, my name the way people say when a doctor's found something. Not alarmed, just noting it. "Claire's still finishing up. Come on in." The house smelled like something expensive from a diffuser. Brian was already in motion, heading back toward the living room, and whatever conversation I'd interrupted, I followed slowly, taking inventory the way I'd spent 4 decades taking inventory, not out of judgment, but out of habit. The furniture was new, not recently new. Conspicuously new, the kind of new that wants to be noticed. A sectional sofa that I estimated at somewhere around $6,000. A dining table with 10 chairs for a family of 4. Abstract art on the walls that Claire would not have chosen. My grandchildren found me before I reached the living room. Lily, 8 years old, appeared from the hallway at a run and hit me at hip height. Owen, 6, was a half step behind her, slower because he was carrying a drawing he wanted to show me. "Grandpa, look." Owen held up the paper. A house, green grass, a yellow sun. Me, apparently, in the corner, identified by a scribbled label that said, "Grappa." "That's a fine house," I said. "Better than most I've built." Brian appeared in the doorway. "Owen, don't bother Grandpa with your drawings. He just walked in. I asked him to show me," I said. Brian's expression suggested I'd said something mildly incorrect. He moved on without responding. Claire came from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked the way she'd been looking for 2 years now, not unhappy exactly, but compressed, like someone who'd learned to take up less space. She was 33 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and a careful quality around them that Ruth never had. Ruth had never been careful. Ruth had been direct and warm and entirely herself until the day she wasn't anymore. "Dad." Claire hugged me with one arm, the dish towel still in the other hand. "Dinner's almost ready. I made the pot roast you like." "It smells right," I said. We sat down. Brian took the head of the table. The children were quiet in the way children learn to be quiet when the atmosphere requires it. Lily kept her eyes on her plate. Owen watched his father with the particular attention of a child, trying to anticipate weather. The Henderson project came through, Brian announced, cutting into his roast with focused precision. 42-unit mixed-use development. We close on the legal structure next month. That's good news, Claire said. It's significant, actually. Not everyone at the firm lands something at that scale. He glanced in my direction. Commercial real estate law. Different animal from residential. High stakes. Takes years to build the credibility. I imagine so, I said. You were in construction, right, Frank? Residential? He knew exactly what I'd been in. We'd had the conversation. But he liked the version where I'd hammered nails for homeowners for 30 years and retired with a modest savings account. That version made the comparison more satisfying. Commercial and industrial, mostly, I said. Some residential in the early years. Right. He poured himself more wine without offering any around the table. Well, the development side is the real business. Anyone can put up a building. The deal-making, the legal structure, the partnerships, that's where the value is. Lily tried to tell me something about her class project. Brian talked over her twice before she stopped trying. After dinner, I asked to see the children's rooms. Owen's winter coat hung on the back of his door, a thin thing more appropriate for September than the cold that was coming. His sneakers near the closet had a split along the left sole that someone had pressed back together and hoped would hold. Lily's desk had a textbook with a cracked spine held shut with a rubber band. On Brian and Claire's bedroom door, left ajar, I could see the edge of a bed with new linens, tags dangling from the pillow shams. I didn't need to read the number. I already knew what things cost. In the living room, I found Brian on his phone, thumb moving. He didn't look up when I said goodnight. He'd already moved on to whatever the next thing was. Thanks for dinner, I said to Claire at the door. She hugged me again, both arms this time briefly. On the drive home to Murfreesboro, I watched the lights of the city recede in the rearview mirror. I thought about Owen's split sole and Lily's rubber-banded textbook. I thought about Claire's careful eyes. I thought about Brian saying anyone can put up a building the way a man says it when he's never held a level in his life. My farmhouse greeted me the way it always did. Quiet, orderly. The kind of place that looks modest until you understand that every choice in it was deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The banking application loaded in 6 seconds. The balance read $271,000 in checking. The investment accounts, the trust structures, the real estate holdings. I kept those in a separate application that I opened less frequently. The total, as of last quarter, was just over $21 million. I'd lived on less than $40,000 a year since I sold the company. The rest had been working. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet. Brian thought I was a retired handyman living on Social Security and stubbornness. Claire had stopped asking about my finances after the first year of their marriage, when Brian had made it clear that the subject made him uncomfortable, meaning it made him difficult to position relative to his father-in-law. And Brian was always positioning. I'd let the assumption stand. I'd had no reason to correct it. Until now, I had no reason to use it either. I opened a fresh document and typed. Observations. October. I wrote for 45 minutes. Brian's spending habits, the visible quality of the children's belongings, Claire's compressed affect, the specific comments at dinner. I noted them without anger. Anger would have been sloppy. I had spent 38 years making decisions about money and land and people. Sloppy decisions cost you. I saved the document to an encrypted folder and went to bed. I gave myself 3 days before I did anything. I'd learned a long time ago that the first version of a decision is usually the right one, and the first version of an action is usually too fast. On the 4th day, I drove to Nashville and had lunch with an old associate of mine named Dale Whitmore, who had spent 20 years as a licensed private investigator after retiring from the Nashville Police Department. Dale was 67 years old, still sharp, and had done confidential work for me twice before in a business context. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has shown you results. I told him what I needed. Surveillance on Brian Walsh, Senior associate at Harmon and Associates. Spending patterns. Schedule. Any behavior inconsistent with his household financial picture. 2 weeks. Full report. Dale produced a legal pad and a pen that was nearly out of ink. He wrote with what remained. Personal or professional? He asked. Personal. He's my son-in-law. Dale nodded once. He didn't ask anything else. That was why I'd chosen him. I paid him $3,000 in cash. We shook hands, and I drove back to Murfreesboro through traffic that had gotten heavier since I was last in the city regularly. That had been a long time ago. The days passed. Dale sent brief updates. No alarm in the language, just facts. Subject at Harmon office. Subject attended lunch meeting, downtown. Subject seen at restaurant Tuesday evening, not with wife. On the 11th day, Dale called and asked to meet. He arrived at my kitchen table with a manila folder an inch thick. He opened it without ceremony and turned it to face me. The photographs were time-stamped. Brian and a younger woman, Dale identified her as Nicole Reeves, 31, junior associate at Harmon and Associates, at 3 different restaurants, over 8 days. His hand on the small of her back, outside a hotel in Midtown. Her leaning into him in the front seat of a car I didn't recognize parked in a garage on 2nd Avenue. One photo captured his wedding ring clearly, gold against the white tablecloth, while his fingers were wrapped around her wrist. How long? I asked. Based on the patterns, I'd estimate 8 months, possibly longer. They're comfortable with each other. This isn't new. I went through each photograph. I didn't rush. Financial picture? I said. Dale produced a second set of pages. He's borrowed significantly against his own name. Personal loans, 4 sources. Total just under $90,000. Credit lines maxed. His salary at the firm is good $160,000 base, plus bonus, but the spending is outrunning it. He pointed to a column of figures. Mortgage, Porsche payment, credit lines, the lifestyle spending, and whatever he's been putting toward the other relationship. The math doesn't sustain itself past 18 months at current rate. Does Claire know about the debt? Nothing in the joint accounts reflects the personal loans. He's managing them through a separate banking relationship she doesn't appear to have visibility into. I sat back. Outside the kitchen window, a pair of cardinals were working the feeder Ruth had hung 20 years ago, and I'd kept filled ever since. What do I owe you for the balance? Another $2,500, Dale said. I'll email the itemized. I wrote him a check. He took the folder when he left. I kept the photographs. He'd given me copies. I drove back to my office, a spare room off the main hallway. The same desk I'd run Caldwell Construction from when the company was still small enough to fit in a farmhouse and spread everything out. Photographs, financial summary, timeline. I built the sequence the same way I'd always built project timelines. Start with what you know for certain. Mark what you need to verify. Identify the critical path. Brian's affair had begun approximately 8 months ago. The debt acceleration matched the timeline. The Porsche had been purchased 11 months ago. The sequence was legible. I pulled up Harmon and Associates on my laptop. I'd known the firm by reputation for years without ever having a direct reason to engage them. Richard Harmon, founding partner, 62 years old, had built the firm over 25 years into one of the more respected commercial real estate, legal, and development practices in the state. They handled complex deal structures, acquisition, legal work, development partnerships. Their current focus area, based on public filings and a few industry publications I found, was large-scale mixed-use development in the suburban growth corridors south of Nashville, specifically Williamson County, which was experiencing the kind of population growth that made commercial land worth 3 times what it had been a decade ago. I stopped reading and sat back. I owned 340 acres in Williamson County. I'd bought it 17 years ago for roughly $800,000 as a long-term hold, before anyone was talking about what that corridor was going to become. In the 2 years since I'd sold Caldwell Construction, 3 different development groups had approached me about the land. I'd declined each one. The land was worth somewhere between $12 and $15 million, depending on who was doing the estimating and what they planned to build. I'd been in no hurry. I read about Harmon and Associates' development division for another hour. Then I opened a new email and addressed it to Richard Harmon directly. using his firm address from the website. I wrote the email under my full legal name, Franklin G. Caldwell, which Brian had never once heard me use. At the dinner table, I was Frank. In Brian's mental file, I was Claire's retired father, a man who'd done something modest in construction before retreating to a farmhouse to watch his relevance expire. The email was brief. I had land holdings in Williamson County. I was reconsidering. I'd heard Harmon and Associates had development interests in the corridor. I preferred handling any preliminary discussions with senior leadership directly, without involving firm associates, as I found discretion important in early-stage conversations. I was available this week. I read it 3 times. Then I sent it. The response came in 4 hours. Richard Harmon himself, not a junior contact. He was familiar with the Williamson corridor. He'd be glad to meet personally. He included his direct line and suggested Thursday morning, private meeting at the firm, before regular business hours. I confirmed Thursday. I spent Wednesday evening preparing. Not nervously, I'd closed transactions worth more than this on worse preparation, but thoroughly. I pulled together everything relevant. Surveys, appraisal records, the 3 declined offers from the past 2 years, documentation of the parcels, a 1-page summary of my ownership history and current position on the land. I put it in a plain manila folder. I selected my clothes for Thursday. Clean dark jeans, a good flannel shirt I'd owned for years, my work boots. I was not going to walk into that office pretending to be something I wasn't. I was going to walk in exactly as I was and let the land speak. Thursday morning, I drove to Nashville in the dark, before commuter traffic built. I parked 2 blocks from the building and walked. The lobby of Harmon and Associates was on the 19th floor of a glass tower on Commerce Street. The receptionist, arriving early herself, confirmed my appointment and walked me back to a corner conference room with a view of the river going bronze in the early light. Richard Harmon arrived 3 minutes later. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, with a handshake that communicated he'd been taking people's measure with it for 30 years. He sat across from me, declined his receptionist's offer of coffee, and looked at me with the direct attention of someone who'd learned that the most expensive conversations often arrived in the least expensive packaging. "Mr. Caldwell," he said. "Franklin Caldwell. You built Caldwell Construction." "I did. Sold it 2 years ago. I know the company. We did parallel work on the Edge Hill development in 2014. Different sides of the table. Good operation." He meant it as a professional assessment. I accepted it as one. "I've been patient with the Williamson land," I said. "But I'm 63 years old and patience has a time horizon. I want to see something built on it before I'm too old to care what it looks like." Harmon smiled at that in a way that reached his eyes. "What are you thinking in terms of development direction?" "Mixed use with a commercial anchor. Retail and professional space on the ground level, residential above. I'd want meaningful green space. That land has a creek running through the western third that I'd want protected, not filled. I'm not interested in maximizing density at the expense of what makes the land worth developing in the first place." Harmon had opened a legal pad. He was writing, "Acreage, 340 acres, 312 developable by my assessment. The creek corridor, I'd hold separately." He looked up. "At current valuations in that corridor, I know what it's worth," I said. "I've had 3 offers in the past 2 years. I turned them all down because none of them understood the land." We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. It was the kind of conversation I'd missed since selling the company, substantive, technical, between 2 people who'd each spent decades understanding how land and money and time interact. At the end of it, Harmon slid a preliminary letter of intent across the table. "This gets us to the next conversation," he said. "No obligation, just structure." I read it. It was clean. I initialed where he indicated. "There's one thing I should mention," I said, collecting my folder. "Go ahead." "My son-in-law works at this firm, Brian Walsh." Harmon's face did something precise and controlled. A small recalibration. "Brian is one of our associates." "Yes. He doesn't know I own the Williamson tract. He doesn't know much about my financial situation generally. I'd prefer to keep this arrangement between senior leadership until we're at a point where formal team assignments are necessary." I paused. I imagine you understand the value of managing family and business separately. Completely, Harmon said. His tone was even, but his eyes were doing the kind of rapid, quiet thinking that experienced people do when they're beginning to understand a situation is more layered than its surface suggested. We shook hands. I walked back through the firm's main floor. It was just beginning to fill with associates arriving for the day, and rode the elevator down without looking for Brian's desk. 3 weeks passed. I talked to Harmon twice by phone. The transaction was taking shape. During those weeks, I also made 2 quiet decisions. The first, I hired a family law attorney in Franklin, a woman named Margaret Torres, whose reputation Claire had mentioned once when she was talking about a friend's divorce. I didn't tell Margaret why I was inquiring. I asked about her approach to custody cases and financial discovery. She was direct, detailed, and unimpressed by complexity. I paid her retainer and told her I'd be in touch. The second decision, I called Claire. Not about any of this, just a call. Her voice on the phone was the careful version, the compressed version. I told her I loved her. I told her I was thinking about Ruth lately, how much her mother would have enjoyed seeing the kids at their ages. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to have its own weight. I miss her, Claire said. I miss her a lot. Me too, sweetheart. I didn't say anything else. I let the silence be what it was. The call from Harmon came on a Tuesday morning. The transaction documentation was finalized. Would I be available Thursday afternoon to execute the formal agreement and complete the initial transfer paperwork? Normal business hours. Conference room, 19. I said I would be there at 2 o'clock. Wednesday evening, I laid out what I was going to wear. The same canvas jacket, the jeans with the faded knee, the flannel shirt. The work boots that had walked 340 acres of Tennessee land in every season. I was not going to arrive as a performance. I was going to arrive as myself. Thursday morning I called Claire. Are you free this evening? I asked. I think so. Why? I'd like to come by after dinner. There's something I need to talk to you about. Nothing's wrong. I want to be clear about that. But it's important. A pause. Okay, Dad. Come at 7. I drove to Nashville in the early afternoon, parked in the public garage I'd used before, the one 2 blocks from the building. I walked the 2 blocks at an even pace, not hurrying. The lobby receptionist recognized me from the earlier visit and smiled. She walked me back to the conference room on 19 glass-walled, visible to the entire open floor plan, where Harmon was waiting with 2 associates I hadn't met, a paralegal and a documentation specialist. I had been seated and had just opened my folder when I heard it. Excuse me, Frank? Brian stood in the glass doorway. He was in a gray suit, his jacket on, a client file under his arm, mid-afternoon, purposeful. He had the particular expression of a man who has encountered something that doesn't belong in the category it appears to be occupying. Brian, I said, what are you doing here? He said it without thinking, the way people say things when they're running on reflex. Then he caught himself and modulated. Is everything all right? Claire? Claire's fine. I have a meeting. A meeting. He looked at Harmon. Then at the documentation on the table. Then back at me. With Richard? Harmon stood. Brian, Mr. Caldwell and I are finalizing an acquisition agreement. We're on a schedule. An acquisition? Brian's voice had shifted. The client file was still under his arm. His eyes moved between the documents on the table, Harmon's face and mine. Frank, what acquisition? What is this? Other associates on the floor had begun to register the conversation. Voices quieted. Attention drifted toward the conference room glass the way it does when something unusual is happening in a place that runs on the ordinary. I'm transferring land holdings in Williamson County to a joint development partnership with this firm, I said. We've been working on the structure for several weeks. Williamson County. He said it slowly. You own land in Williamson County. 340 acres. I've held it for 17 years. Brian set the client file down on the nearest empty surface. He didn't do it intentionally. He just let go of it. That's what's the value on that land right now, Harmon answered before I could. The basis for this transaction is $14.2 million, plus development partnership terms. He said it in the tone of someone closing a door on a tangential conversation. Brian's face went through the same dissolution I'd anticipated. Not all at once, piece by piece. 14 million. He looked at me. You live in Murfreesboro. You drive a truck. I do live in Murfreesboro, I said. And I do drive a truck. I've driven trucks my whole life. They carry things. You let me believe. He stopped. He was recalculating in real time, and the math was not going the way he needed it to. I didn't let you believe anything, Brian. You reached your own conclusions, and I didn't go out of my way to change them. There's a difference. You own a construction company. I sold it. 2 years ago. For how much? He asked it without meaning to. It came out the way things come out when the filter goes down. $19 million, I said. The open floor was very quiet now. Harmon's paralegal had her pen down. The documentation specialist was looking at a fixed point on the table. One of Harmon's associates near the back of the room had stopped pretending to look at his phone. Brian's mouth opened, closed. He put one hand on the back of a chair. That's not possible, he said. You were a builder. You built houses. Commercial and industrial, mostly. Some residential in the early years. I used his language back to him. The same words, the same cadence. I watched him recognize them. Harmon moved around the table. His voice was professionally level, but the temperature beneath it had dropped. Brian, this is a confidential client meeting. I'm going to need you to step back to your desk. Richard, this is my father-in-law. I should have been. You should have been at your desk, which is where I need you now. Harmon looked at him with the specific expression of a senior partner who has just been required to say a thing he preferred not to have had reason to say. Brian looked at me one more time. He was trying to find something to hold on to, something that restored the arrangement he'd understood. I gave him nothing, not hostility, not satisfaction, just the same face I'd had across from him at every dinner table for 4 years. He picked up his client file and walked back to his desk. I signed the documents. Harmon walked me through each one, explaining what I already understood, which is what you do when you respect someone's time. When the last page was executed, he gathered the copies with the careful efficiency of a man who was glad to have this particular client. Welcome to the partnership, Frank, he said. I appreciate the work you put in, I said. He walked me to the elevator. As the doors opened, I heard him speak to his assistant behind me. Tell Brian Walsh I need to see him in my office when he's finished with the Holloway file, and ask HR to pull his employment file. I rode the elevator down alone. I sat in the truck for 5 minutes. Not from emotion, from the same habit I'd had after every major close. Give it a moment, make sure everything that needed doing had been done, then move. I drove to Brentwood. Claire answered the door at 7:05. The children were upstairs. I could hear Owen's video game through the ceiling, the small percussive sounds of imaginary combat. Come in, Dad. She stepped back. She looked the same way she'd looked on the phone, careful, contained, watching my face for information. We sat at the kitchen table. I'd brought nothing with me. The photographs were on my phone. The financial documents I'd left at home, but I knew the numbers. I need to tell you some things, I said. Some of them are going to be hard. I want you to hear all of them before you say anything, if you can. She nodded once. I told her about the investigation first. Not every detail. The relevant ones. Brian and Nicole Reeves. 8 months, by Dale's estimate. The hotels, the restaurants, the pattern of behavior that Dale had documented. Claire's hands were flat on the table. She didn't move them. I took out my phone and opened the photographs. I placed it in front of her and let her look. She took the phone without speaking. She went through every image. Her face was very still in the way a face goes still when it's doing enormous interior work. His hand? She said quietly. She was looking at the photograph with the wedding ring visible against the tablecloth. I know. She set the phone down and looked at the wall for a moment. There's more, I said. I told her about the debt. $90,000 in personal loans Brian carried alone. Credit lines Claire had never seen. The total family debt picture, including the mortgage and the Porsche, approaching $400,000. His base salary swallowed by a lifestyle built for 2 separate lives. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was even. How long have you known? About 3 weeks. Why didn't you? She stopped herself. Thought for a moment. You needed to be sure. Yes. She stood and walked to the kitchen window the way you walk when you need to move but have nowhere specific to go. Outside the backyard was dark, just the shape of the swing set the kids used when it was warm. I also need to tell you about my own finances, I said, because I let you not know for too long, and that wasn't fair to you. She turned. What do you mean? When I sold the company 2 years ago, the final number was $19 million. I have additional holdings land, investments that bring the total closer to $21 million. I've been living on less than $40,000 a year since then by choice. I liked the farmhouse. I liked the quiet. I didn't need to make it a performance. She stared at me. I know that's a lot to take in at once, I said. Dad. Her voice broke on the word. Not from the money, from something else. You've been watching us, watching me, living like this while you... Why didn't you just tell me? Because you wouldn't have believed me. Not about Brian. Not then. You'd have found a reason it wasn't what it looked like. You needed to see it clearly, without me standing between you and it. She put her face in her hands. I waited. I didn't try to fill the silence. Eventually, she straightened up. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't shaking. She looked more like her mother in that moment than she had in years. I heard a car pull in, she said. The Porsche. I heard it too. Brian came through the front door carrying a box from his office. Tie loosened, something broken in his posture that hadn't been there when I'd seen him at the firm. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me the way a man looks at the specific person who watched the thing happen. You were there all along, he said. This was all you set this up. I had a meeting, I said. I've had land in Williamson County for 17 years. The meeting had been in progress for weeks before today. You knew what walking in there would do. I knew it would be honest. I'd been honest. I'd used my real name. You'd made assumptions, and they were yours to make. He looked at Claire. Something in his face was still calculating, looking for a door, the way people look for doors when the ones they came in through are closing. Whatever your father told you? He showed me photographs, she said. The calculation stopped. Claire. Nicole Reeves. She said the name the way you say something you wish you didn't know. 8 months, Brian. He set the box down on the counter. He opened his mouth. He tried 3 different starts to a sentence, and none of them formed. And $90,000 in loans I've never seen, she said. While we talked about whether Owen could be in soccer this spring because of the registration fees. I can explain the money. Get out. He looked around the kitchen. At the box. At me. At Claire. This is my house, he said. It's our house, and I want you to leave tonight. Her voice was entirely level. It had the quality of a decision made, not a reaction in progress. I want you to take what you need for a few days, and I want you to leave. My father is here. The children are upstairs. I'm not going to do this in front of them. The silence stretched. Brian picked up the box. He walked down the hall to the master bedroom, and I heard him moving in there for several minutes. When he came back, his keys were in his hand. He stopped in front of me. I expected anger. What I got was something more like grief, which surprised me slightly. Not grief for anything he'd done. Grief for the version of the story where he'd won. You could have just told her, he said. You didn't have to do it that way. I told her tonight, I said. The way I did it, you'll have consequences to face. That's different from just telling her. He left through the front door. The Porsche started in the driveway, sat for a moment, and then moved away down the street. Claire came back to the table. She sat and looked at her hands. Are you okay? I asked. No, she said. But I think I will be. We sat there until Owen came downstairs to ask about a snack, and then it was just Grandpa being there on a Thursday night, which was a normal thing, and we made popcorn, and I helped Lily with a reading assignment she'd been stuck on. And for a while, the house was just a house with people in it, finding their way through an evening. 4 months later, I sat in a family court in Franklin. Claire's attorney, Margaret Torres, was at the plaintiff's table with the focused ease of someone who had done this work for 20 years and still took each case personally. Across the aisle, Brian sat with a court-appointed representative. He'd attempted to retain private counsel and had been unable to sustain the retainer. Judge Whitfield reviewed the materials with the unhurried attention of someone who had seen every variation of this story and still read each new one completely. The proceeding was thorough and relatively brief. The documentation of the affair was undisputed. The financial deception, the hidden loans, the separate accounts was methodically presented by Margaret in language that made it impossible to minimize. Brian's representative attempted twice to raise the question of my role, suggesting external influence had complicated the proceeding. Judge Whitfield addressed this directly and moved on. Primary custody went to Claire. Standard visitation rights for Brian. Child support calculated against his current income, which was no longer Harmon and Associates. Harmon had terminated Brian's employment 4 days after the conference room finalization, citing conduct inconsistent with the firm's client relationship standards. Brian's separate debts remained his responsibility. The house in Brentwood was awarded to Claire, the equity in it outweighing the encumbrance once his personal debts were excluded from the marital picture. The gavel came down. Margaret gathered her materials with quiet efficiency. I walked out of the courthouse behind Claire into a February afternoon that was cold but bright. The kind of cold that feels clean rather than punishing. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," I said. "I know." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that knows what it's earned. "Thank you, Dad, for all of it." "You did the hard part," I said. "You made the choice. I just handed you information." She hugged me in the parking lot, both arms, for a long time. 5 months after that, I was at Claire's kitchen table helping Owen with long division when Lily, working on a science project at the counter, suddenly said, "Grandpa, is it true you built buildings?" "For 38 years, I said. "Big buildings?" "Warehouses, mostly. Office parks, some hospitals, whatever people needed built." Owen looked up from his math. "Did you have a truck?" "I had 17 trucks at one point." He considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old doing math he hasn't been taught yet. "How come you only have one now?" "Because one is enough to carry what I need to carry." Claire came home at 5:30 with her coat still on, cheeks red from the cold. She was working at an environmental consulting firm in Franklin, a job she'd found in January, and had described to me twice with the particular satisfaction of someone using a part of themselves that had been in storage. She put her bag down and looked at the three of us at the table. "Good day?" I asked. "Really good. We finalized the creek restoration proposal. It's a significant project." She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "The kids eat yet?" "Not yet. Owen promised to finish the worksheet first." Owen protested briefly and insincerely. Lily asked if we could have pancakes for dinner, which was a Tuesday night thing Ruth had invented when Claire was small and which apparently had survived into the next generation. We had pancakes. After the children were in bed, Claire and I sat with tea the way we'd been doing on her Tuesday evenings since February. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Go ahead. When you arranged everything, the meeting with Harmon, the timing, you knew it was going to be public. Other people in the office were going to see it happen." "Yes," I said. "Was that necessary? Could you have done it privately?" I'd asked myself the same thing many times. I gave her the same honest answer I'd worked out. "I could have told you privately. I could have helped you leave privately. But Brian had spent 4 years making you feel small in private. Every dinner, every conversation about money, every time he talked over you in your own house. Private correction would have disappeared. The way private humiliation disappears, absorbed, minimized, eventually explained away. He needed to face what he'd done in a room he couldn't control. And you needed to know that the person he'd been underestimating all that time wasn't the person he thought." She was quiet for a moment. "Mom would have had something sharp to say about all of this," she said. "Your mother never said a thing that wasn't worth saying. Usually at the exact wrong moment for whoever needed to hear it." Claire laughed. The real laugh, not the careful version. She would have told Brian exactly what she thought of him at that first Thanksgiving. I think she was going to, and I asked her not to. "She told me about it," I said. "She did?" "She said you seemed happy and she was going to trust you." I looked at my tea. "She trusted you right up until she wasn't here to trust you anymore. That doesn't stop, you know. The trusting. It just goes quiet for a while." Claire reached across the table and put her hand over mine. We stayed there for a few minutes without talking, which was one of the things Ruth had taught us both how to do. Driving home later on the interstate, the lights of Franklin falling behind me, I thought about Brian's last words to me in the kitchen. You could have just told her. You didn't have to do it that way. I'd thought about that more than I'd expected to, whether the public part had been about justice or about something less clean, whether there was a version of this where fewer people had witnessed his worst day. Probably there was. I could have met Harmon privately. I could have handled the transfer by mail. I could have let the whole thing be quiet and clinical. But Brian had spent 4 years being loud about who I was. He'd spent 4 years making his assumptions public over dinner tables, in front of the children, in front of anyone who happened to be present when he wanted to establish the hierarchy. He'd assumed I was finished. He'd assumed I was watching from the margins of my own family, because that was all I was capable of. He'd taught his children, by example, that the measure of a man was what he drove and where he lived, and how loudly he could announce both. I had not set out to humiliate him. I had set out to handle a piece of business, and to stop pretending that what he thought of me had any bearing on what I was. It turned out those two things were indistinguishable in practice. I could live with that. My farmhouse came up on the left, the porch light on, the way I'd left it. I parked and sat for a moment before going in. On the passenger seat was a folder from an attorney in Franklin who specialized in educational trust structures. I'd been working on it for 3 weeks. The beneficiaries were Owen and Lily college funds, with provisions for graduate school, for professional certification, for whatever they turned out to need from the money. The amounts were specific, and the language was careful, and it would be in place before either of them was old enough to understand what it meant. I picked up the folder and took it inside. The money had never been the point. Ruth had understood that better than I did when we were young. She'd watched me build the company for 38 years, and she'd never once asked me what it was worth. She'd asked me whether I was proud of what we'd built, whether the people who worked for us were being treated right, whether I'd be able to look at it when it was done and say that we'd done something honest with our time. I could look at it now. $19 million was a number. What we'd built was a different thing entirely, and it had nothing to do with the bank account. I sat at my desk and opened the trust documents and started working. Before I went to bed, I checked my phone. A text from Claire, sent 20 minutes after I'd left. The kids asked if you could come Sunday. Owen wants to show you something he built out of Legos. Apparently it's a warehouse. I smiled at the dark farmhouse around me. I typed back, "Tell him I'll bring my critical eye." I set the phone down and went to sleep.